listen to me in English. And I'd also like to thank Teresa and Ernesto and the Institute and the faculty for making it possible for me to come to this lovely city, which I've never been to before. It's been a great pleasure, so thank you very much. Okay, so today I want to talk, yesterday I was talking about the role of biography in the understanding of intellectuals. And today I want to talk particularly about the role of biography in understanding Wittgenstein. I said yesterday that my interest in biography was first aroused by my studies of Wittgenstein's work, and funnily enough, it was the aspect of his work that you'd think was the least relevant to biography, which is his logic and philosophy of mathematics. But that was my background, and as I said yesterday, I was drawn into biographical research by the thought that one way of correctly understanding Wittgenstein's writing would be to have some understanding of him. And I think this is particularly true in Britain because there was in those days, I'm talking about 30 years ago now, there was in those days a lack of appreciation of the importance of the fact that Wittgenstein was not British. He didn't read what British philosophers read. He didn't listen to the music that British philosophers listened to. He was from a different culture. And that fact alone seemed to me worth investigating and pursuing and tying to the understanding of Wittgenstein. My own supervisor at Oxford was the most British person I've ever met, Peter Strawson, Sir Peter Strawson. And I remember talking to him about Wittgenstein, and he was saying, well, because Wittgenstein was criticizing some English novelists, and Strawson said to me, well, what novelist did Wittgenstein like? And I said, well, he loved Tolstoy, he loved Dostoevsky. And Peter Strawson said to me, yes, but they're so extreme, aren't they? And Strawson himself was not well equipped to understand Wittgenstein's personality. So, Wittgenstein, as I say, came from Vienna, and that is a crucially important part in understanding who he is. Secondly, he came from an immensely wealthy family. It's unbelievably wealthy. His father virtually owned the iron and steel industry of the Habsburg Empire. And the family had, just come down here for a minute, the family had several homes. The main one of which, the one in which Ludwig Wittgenstein was brought up, was this extraordinarily opulent house called the Palais Wittgenstein. It no longer exists. It was pulled down in the 1960s, and where it is now is a multi-story car park, I'm afraid. But in those days, when Wittgenstein was brought up in the end of the 19th century, you can see the scale of the staircase, the red salon. Wittgenstein used to say that his home had 7 grand pianos in it, which gives you some idea of the scale. But the family were not only very rich, they were also very accomplished. His mother was a very gifted pianist. And the culture of the family, the literature, the music, was all of a very high standard. And to some extent, the interests in cultural activities, the interest in music and literature and drama, the clash between that and the father's business interest in the iron and steel industry led to a series of family tragedies, which was also an important part of the background in which Ludwig Wittgenstein grew up. The oldest son here is Hans, and Hans was a musical prodigy of Mozartian standards. He was playing piano concertos at the age of 5. He was composing music at the age of 7. And he wanted to dedicate his life to music. But his father insisted that he apply himself to the iron and steel industry. And Hans reacted to that by running away from Vienna. He ran away to the United States of America, where his body was found in Chesapeake Bay, the assumption being that he'd committed suicide. That was when Ludwig Wittgenstein was still a young boy. And a couple of years later, another brother, Rudolf, also committed suicide. There was a similar kind of tension between Rudy and the father. In Rudy's case, this was to do with two things. One, that he was homosexual, and two, that he wanted a career in the theatre. And he also ran away from home. He ran away to Berlin, and he also committed suicide, in this case in a spectacularly public fashion. He walked into a gay bar in Berlin, ordered 2 drinks, asked the pianist to play a love song, and killed himself there and then. After which, the father relaxed a little bit. So Ludwig did not have the repressive upbringing that Hans and Rudolf had had. The brother closest to Ludwig was Paul. So here we have Paul and Ludwig, and the three sisters, Hermina, Margaret, and Helena, were all very close to Ludwig. The father relented about education, and whereas he'd had Hans and Rudolf privately educated in a kind of hothouse kind of atmosphere, Paul Wittgenstein and Ludwig Wittgenstein were allowed to go to school, and also Paul Wittgenstein was allowed what Hans Wittgenstein had not been allowed, which was to pursue a musical career. He became a concert pianist, and a very good one, but he lost his right arm in the First World War, and because they were Wittgensteins, he didn't let that stop him. He commissioned piano concertos for the left hand from all the top composers of the day. Ravel wrote a left-handed concerto for Paul, so did Prokofiev, so did Benjamin Britten. And so Paul continued his career as a concert pianist after the First World War, playing works written for the left hand. I'll just mention the other brother here, who was Kurt, who also committed suicide, but a few years later, at the end of the First World War, he was an officer in a fancy regiment. The men under his command deserted him, and he thought the only honourable way to react to that situation was to shoot himself. So 3 of Ludwig Wittgenstein's brothers committed suicide. So when one imagines the family background that produced this extraordinary individual, one has to think of their wealth, their culture, and also their tragedy. With regard to the culture, the family was right at the heart of Viennese culture during one of its most interesting, fertile, and creative periods at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. And the Wittgensteins involved themselves in the various movements that were going on, including an important movement in art called the Jugendstil, the young style, of painters who included Klimt and Schiller and Kokoschka. And they exhibited their work in the Secession building, which is still there in Vienna. It's an extraordinary building. It was paid for by Wittgenstein's father, Karl Wittgenstein, who also commissioned from Klimt this extraordinarily beautiful painting of Ludwig's sister, the sister that was actually closest to him, Margaret. There's a story about this painting that I never met Margaret, of course, or Ludwig, or that generation, but I did go to Vienna and meet later generations of Wittgensteins, and I met Margaret's grandson, Pierre, who now lives in Vienna, but he was brought up in New York City. And he told me a story about when he was a young boy going to Vienna to meet his grandmother, who he didn't know very well. And she lived in a very grand apartment in Vienna. And he told me that one day she pulled out from behind a sofa this painting by Klimt. She said to Pierre, "Do you like this painting?" And Pierre said to me, "Had I known then what I know now, I would have answered differently." But what he said was, "No, not very much." So instead of being given to Pierre, the painting was sold to the Munich Art Gallery, and it is now, I would imagine, quite literally priceless. This could have changed Pierre's life considerably. Now, music was the art that the Wittgenstein family were keenest on, which they were most involved with, and again, the leading contributors to the Viennese musical scene were family friends, including Johannes Brahms, who was a regular attender of musical events in the music salon in the Palais Wittgenstein, and actually several of Brahms's works received their first performance in Wittgenstein's house, including most notably his clarinet quintet. Another close family friend was Joseph Labor, the composer and organist, who was a protege of the Wittgenstein family and who was allowed to pursue his career because of the patronage given to him by the Wittgensteins. But as I said, Ludwig and Paul were allowed to pursue their education in schools rather than, as Hans and Rudolf had been educated, by having private tutors come to the house. And there's a mystery that I've never succeeded in solving, which is this, that Paul Wittgenstein, who was a few years older than Ludwig, went to a rather good gymnasium, the equivalent of a British grammar school. Do you have such things in Mexico, grammar school, sort of selective?
No.
Okay. So it was a selective school, like a British grammar school, that only admitted the brightest and best students. And Paul went to that school, and it was a very good school. Ludwig, however, didn't go to school in Vienna. He went to school in Linz. And it wasn't a well thought of gymnasium, a selective school. It was the opposite. It was the Realschule, which is distinguished only for one thing. It was the school that Adolf Hitler went to. Adolf Hitler and Ludwig Wittgenstein were almost identical ages. They were born within a few days of each other. And this photograph has become widely circulated because of an insane book called The Jew of Linz. Has anybody here read The Jew of Linz?
I did.
Do you agree that it's insane?
I was going to ask you about that.
Let me summarize the argument of The Jew of Linz. The Jew of Linz is written by an Australian philosopher called Kimberly Cornish, who's actually a protege of Karl Popper's, the Popperian philosopher. And the thesis of this book is that Ludwig Wittgenstein single-handedly caused the Holocaust. And the argument for that is that Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf describes going to the Realschule in Linz and forming an intense hatred of a Jewish boy who was there. And Kimberly Cornish argues that Jewish boy must have been Wittgenstein. And so Wittgenstein is responsible for arousing in Hitler the hatred of the Jews that changed the course of the 20th century. He doesn't stop there, though. In the second half of the book, he says, look, Wittgenstein was at Cambridge. There was a spy ring working for the Soviet Union in Cambridge at that time. And we know there were 5 prominent members of this spy ring. It was known at the time who the first 4 was. It wasn't known who the 5th member of the spy ring was. Kimberly Cornish says, it must be Wittgenstein. It all adds up. However, this photograph, that is certainly Adolf Hitler. There's no doubt that that's Adolf Hitler. There is some doubt but that is Ludwig Wittgenstein. And the reason there is some doubt about that is this, that although Wittgenstein and Hitler attended the same school at the same time, and although they were practically the same age, they were never in the same class. Because Wittgenstein was very brilliant and was moved up a year, Hitler wasn't and was moved down a year, and so they were never in the same class. This evidently is a class photograph. So I think the chances are that this is not Ludwig Wittgenstein. Also, I don't believe anybody at the school knew that Wittgenstein was a Jew. They knew he was a Wittgenstein. They knew he wasn't like them. He had the manners, the courtly manners of the haute bourgeoisie. He wasn't pally like they were. He addressed them using the formal Sie rather than the informal Du. And so they knew but they would have thought he was an aristocratic person from Vienna. I don't believe it would have been widely known that he was a Jew. So, all in all, I don't think Kimberly Cornish's thesis has much going for it. Well, we can talk about this.
We can talk about it.
What is puzzling, and I still haven't solved this puzzle, is why Wittgenstein was sent to this second-rate school in the first place, which had nothing going for it. It wasn't a particularly great school. It was a long way from Vienna. The only chink of explanation I can offer about that is that in this extraordinary family, Wittgenstein, believe it or not, was actually regarded as the slow one. He was regarded as the one who wasn't brilliant. He wasn't a great pianist. He wasn't a great writer. He wasn't an intellectual. The intellectual of the family was Margaret. She was the one who read Freud. She was the one who read all the cutting-edge literature. She was the one who was a friend of Karl Kraus, the leading writer in Vienna of that time. Poor old Ludwig spent his time making things out of matches. And he was regarded as intellectually a bit dim. So I think that's probably why he was sent to this school. While at this school, he, encouraged by Margaret, read two works that were to have a profound influence on his philosophy. You can see that his real education happened at home. That's where he was introduced to the great music, the great literature, the great art of the period. And it's when he went home from the Realschule in Linz that Margaret was introducing him to books of serious intellectual content. Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation, I imagine a number of you know this work. It had a profound influence on Austrian philosophy. And what it does is present a kind of metaphysics clearly that owes a lot to Kant's metaphysics in the Critique of Pure Reason. Only where Kant has a distinction between noumena and phenomena, between the things as they are in themselves and the things as they appear to us, Schopenhauer's equivalent of that is the distinction between the world as will and the world as representation. So the world as representation is more or less Kant's phenomenon. The world as will, on the other hand, is quite different from anything one finds in Kant's philosophy, except that it shares something with Kant's notion of the thing in itself. However, unlike Kant's notion of the thing in itself, Schopenhauer's notion of the will is something that we can have some kind of access to, chiefly through music. And this, I think, had a great influence on Wittgenstein. The metaphysics generally, one sees some echo of that in his first book, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, but also the veneration of music that one sees in Schopenhauer's work was part of Wittgenstein's life throughout his life. Towards the end of his life, about a month before he died, he said to his friend Maurice Drury, "How can I be understood when I cannot say anything about the immense amount that music has meant to me?" Well, I think it's striking that Schopenhauer regards music as the thing that gives us access to the thing in itself. And Schopenhauer presents that as a solution to something that I think is puzzling and puzzled Wittgenstein and has puzzled many people, which is, why does music mean so much? And why is it, when we're deeply stirred by a piece of music, that we are often unable to say what it is that it means to us? And Schopenhauer presents this as a solution to that problem. We are unable to say what it means because our language is confined to the world as representation. But our music gives us access to the world as will, and as it were, our language cannot follow. So we can listen to, let's say, Beethoven's Fifth, we can be profoundly stirred by it, but we have no words for it. That set of ideas, I think, had a great influence on Wittgenstein. Now, Otto Weininger's Sex and Character is a different kettle of fish. Has anybody here read Sex and Character? It's a mad book. When I didn't read it until I was researching my biography of Wittgenstein. And when I read it, I was absolutely astonished, because Wittgenstein used to cite this book. He used to list Weininger as one of the main influences on his thought. When he went to Cambridge, he used to present copies of this book, Sex and Character, to his friends, who were naturally very puzzled. Here's a summary of the theory in Sex and Character. The theory is that men, and only men, have the obligation to realize the genius within themselves. Women can't do that because women don't have the necessary intellectual capacity. So he says men think in concepts. He has a word for what women think in, which is henids. And a henid is preconception. So when you're struggling to find the word for something, what you have in your mind before you have a word for it is a henid. And Weininger says in Sex and Character that women think in henids, which is why they fall in love with men more intelligent than themselves. Because then those men can give voice to, can give words to their as yet incoherent thoughts. Also, women are a lost cause ethically because they do not have access to the world of thoughts and reason, which is closely allied to the world of ethical responsibility and duty. This is given a further twist by his view that Jews are a kind of woman. So Jews also are ethically a lost cause and have no genius. And he says this is why Jewish work is so reproductive, so Jewish work copies the work of the real genius. And also, he says, homosexuals are a kind of woman. So homosexuals, likewise, cannot be geniuses. Now, Weininger himself was both Jewish and homosexual. And Hitler once described Weininger as the only honest Jew, because when this book was published in 1903, Weininger committed suicide. There was an awful lot of suicide in Vienna at this time. Weininger committed suicide by an incredibly symbolic way. He walked into the home of Beethoven, who is every Viennese person's idea of the perfect genius. He walked into Beethoven's home, stood by the mantelpiece, and shot himself. Now, why did Wittgenstein admire this book so much? Well, it's quite self-evidently mad. My view on that is that it's nothing to do with Weininger's thoughts on homosexuals and on Jews and on women and all of that. I don't see any trace in Wittgenstein's thought of that. There are admittedly some problematic remarks made in 1931 about Jews, but I think that has much more to do with Wittgenstein's own reflection and turning on his own reflection the racial language that was then in vogue because of the rise of anti-Semitism and Nazism. I don't think that owes anything to Weininger. What I think Wittgenstein did get from Weininger what is summed up in this remark. Logic and ethics are fundamentally the same. They are no more than duty to oneself. When I read that, I thought, yes, that's what Wittgenstein got from Vining. And that does chime with everything one knows about Wittgenstein, because one can see Wittgenstein's life as dedicated in an incredibly single-minded way to two aspects of what he clearly considered to be the same duty. And you could summarize these two aspects by saying what he most wanted was to think clearly and to behave decently. Logic and ethics. And this is why I called my book The Duty of Genius, because the idea, Vininger's idea, that the duty we all have is to realize the genius within us, and that the realization of that genius is a combination of thinking clearly and behaving decently, a combination of logic and ethics. One does see that running throughout Wittgenstein's life and dictating what he did. He would divest himself of anything that got in the way of that. So, for example, when his father died, Wittgenstein was one of the richest men in Europe. His reaction to that was to give his money away. First of all, he gave substantial sums of money to Austrian artists and writers, and that itself was significant. Then after the war, after the First World War, he gave the rest of his money away, and it was a substantial sum, to his sisters. His argument for that was that they were already so rich that a bit more wouldn't do any harm. So after he gave away all his money, Wittgenstein was penniless. And the reason he gave his money away, I'm sure, is that he didn't want any distractions from his twin goals of thinking clearly and behaving decently. And you can see that he stripped down his life. He never married, he never owned a house. He had as few possessions as possible, even books. He had remarkably few books. He lived in very simple apartments, and his life was pared down to allow himself to be free from any distractions from the two duties that are suggested by Vininger. Now, Wittgenstein didn't, like his brothers Hans and Rudolf, challenge his father's conception of what constituted a good education. He was happy to learn engineering, and he did learn engineering in Vienna and then in Berlin, and then he came to Manchester in 1908 to study specifically aeronautical engineering. This was in the very early days of aeronautical engineering, and he was, in a pioneering department, in a pioneering subject. He started on the hills of Glossop, just outside Manchester, flying kites, where there is, in all honesty, plenty of wind, so flying kites would be all right. But then he got interested in a jet engine. He started to design a jet engine of a peculiar kind. It has been built now, and it does kind of work, although you wouldn't want to fly in an aircraft propelled by this engine. The basic principle of the engine is that the emission of jet bursts propel the propeller. A bit like when you have a water sprinkler on a lawn in a garden, the force of the water turns the thing around so that it sprinkles and waters the lawn. Now, he became intensely interested in the design specifically of the propeller. And that is an essentially mathematical task. And so while he was in Manchester, he got very interested in mathematics. First of all, he moves from applied mathematics in the design of propeller to pure mathematics. He gets very interested in pure mathematics. And then, independently of any reading he's done, he gets seized by a philosophical question. The philosophical question being, what is mathematics? What are numbers? what is mathematical truth? And he was asking around in Manchester, you know, does anybody know of any books that address these questions? And somebody said, yeah, Bertrand Russell in 1903 published Principles of Mathematics. You should read that. So Wittgenstein read Principles of Mathematics, and asked, how many people here are familiar with Russell's paradox? Really? Okay, I'm going to have to explain it to you then. And you've only got yourselves to blame. Okay, here's Russell's paradox. So Russell's theory is that mathematics is just logic. I better not go over. How long can I keep talking for?
Oh, don't worry.
Okay, I won't spend too long on it, and if it doesn't make any sense, don't worry about it. Wittgenstein's theory, Russell's theory, was that mathematics is just logic, and that numbers are sets. Now you might think, big deal, what's the advance there? Well, number is a mathematical notion, set is a logical notion. So, at the heart of Principles of Mathematics is an attempt to show that mathematics is really founded on set theory. Now, Russell started reflecting on sets, and he came across the following contradiction, which goes like this. Most sets are not members of themselves. But there are a few sets, because they're sets of sets, that could be members of themselves. So, for example, the one he was interested in was the set of all sets. Now, the set of all sets is a member of itself. Whereas the set of chairs is not a chair, the set of tables is not a table. So most sets are not members of themselves. So we have sets which are members of themselves, sets which are not members of themselves. So Russell said, what if you collected together the set of all sets which are not members of themselves? So this set includes all, so to speak, normal sets. The set of tables, the set of chairs, and so on. So now we have the set of all sets which are not members of themselves. And then Russell, being a philosopher and a logician, asks this question, which is the question that does the damage. Is that set a member of itself or not? And the answer is, if yes, then no. And if no, then yes. Because if it is a member of itself, it shouldn't be, because it's the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. But if it's not a member of itself, it should be, because it's supposed to be the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. So we have a paradox, a contradiction. At about the same time, Russell realized that he'd been anticipated in his so-called logicism, his view that mathematics is just logic. He'd been anticipated by the great German mathematician and logician Gottlob Frege, who, a couple of decades before Russell's work, had published exactly the same idea that mathematics is really logic and should be founded on sets. So Russell wrote to Frege and said, yeah, I see that we're, because nobody read Frege, everyone just ignored him, nobody understood what he wrote, except Russell. Russell wrote to Frege saying, yeah, you know, we've got a beautiful theory, but what about this paradox? Frege wrote back saying, arithmetic totters. His whole theory of arithmetic was now in ruins, and poor old Frege had a nervous breakdown. Russell, however, published his book, Principles of Mathematics, containing the theory, but having a chapter on what he called the contradiction, which is now called Russell's paradox. And he ends this chapter by, so the chapter discusses all the problems to do with this contradiction. And he ends the chapter on this indecisive note. He says, what the complete solution of the difficulty may be, I have not succeeded in discovering. But as it affects the very foundations of reasoning, I earnestly commend the study of it to the attention of all students of logic. Now, Wittgenstein read that and took up the challenge and became obsessed with trying to find a solution to Russell's paradox. Amina, his oldest sister, wrote a diary, wrote a series of reflections, recollections, and she says, at this time, or shortly after, 1908, philosophy, or rather reflection on philosophical problems, suddenly became such an obsession with him and took hold of him so completely against his will that he suffered terribly, feeling torn between conflicting vocations. So, as it were, he was now back in the territory of Hans and Rudolf, worrying that if he was to pursue his own bent, which was to address himself to the problems of logic and philosophy and mathematics, he would be going against the vocation that had been determined for him of studying aeronautical engineering and becoming an aeronaut. So, 1909, 1910, he pursued both these activities. He kept up with his engineering, he kept up trying to design his propeller and design his engine. Meanwhile, he pursued his obsession with philosophy, and particularly the philosophy of mathematics. And eventually, he could bear it no more. And in 1911, he just went down to Cambridge. He hadn't enrolled in any courses, he hadn't been in touch with Russell. He just took the train from Manchester to Cambridge, went straight into Russell's rooms and announced himself. Russell at that time was writing 3 letters a day to his mistress, Ottilie Morrell, and so this is captured almost moment by moment in his letters. And in one of the letters he says, I was giving my lecture when an unknown German appeared. And he said in a later letter, this unknown German threatens to be an affliction. Because what Wittgenstein did was, he attended Russell's lectures and then followed Russell wherever he went. If Russell went to dinner, Wittgenstein was there. If Russell went back to his rooms to change for dinner, Wittgenstein was there. All the time talking logic. Russell wasn't sure whether he was just a lunatic or whether he was worth encouraging. So at the end of that term, Wittgenstein went to Russell and said, do you think I've got any talent for philosophy? Because if I haven't, I'll go back to Manchester and resume my studies in aeronautical engineering. If I have got talent, he said, I'll stay here. And you can see a Weiningerian theme here, which is, if he's got talent, but only if he's got talent, he has a duty to be at Cambridge pursuing that. If he doesn't, then he has no right at all to be there. So Russell said, because the way Wittgenstein had asked this was, do you think I'm an idiot or not? So Russell, being direct and British, said, I have no idea if you're an idiot or not. And he said, well, write something. So Wittgenstein spent the Christmas vacation writing something, and Russell says, when he read it, he said to Wittgenstein, no, you must not be an aeronaut, you must be a philosopher. So Wittgenstein then signed up as officially a student of Russell's, and within a year, Russell was saying to people that he expected the next big advance to come from Wittgenstein. The next big advance in philosophy would come from Wittgenstein. The next big advance being an answer not to the question, what is mathematics, but rather to the question, what is logic? That was the question that Russell, as it were, bequeathed to Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein became obsessed with this question, what is logic? And he felt after a year at Cambridge that he could no longer do it at Cambridge. He had to live by himself in a remote part of the world, and he chose northern Norway, the fields of Norway. When he said to Russell, I'm fed up with Cambridge, I want to go to Norway, work on my philosophy in a hut by the side of the field, Russell remembers, I said it would be dark, and he said he hated daylight. I said it would be lonely, and he said he prostituted his mind talking to intelligent people. I said he was mad, and he said, God preserve him from sanity. To which Russell added, God certainly will. So Wittgenstein went to Norway and worked alone, apart from inviting the Cambridge philosopher G.E. Moore to his hut in Norway. And this is an extraordinary situation because Wittgenstein was then he never published anything. He was an unknown philosopher. G.E. Moore was one of the leading philosophers of the day. venerated by the Bloomsbury Group, the leading literary group of the day. And G.E. Moore was prepared to travel to Norway, to a remote field in northern Norway, basically to act as Wittgenstein's secretary. Wittgenstein dictated notes on logic to G.E. Moore in Norway. And they contain, those notes on logic contain a distinction that would be what Wittgenstein would later describe as, in Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, the most important aspect of the work. This is the distinction between what we can say, what we cannot say. And the first appearance of that distinction is with regard to logic. So Wittgenstein says, logical so-called propositions show the logical properties of language and therefore of the universe, but say nothing. Every real proposition shows something besides what it says about the universe. For if it has no sense, it can't be used, and if it has a sense, it mirrors some logical property of the universe. So this was his breakthrough in the question, what is logic? Logic is that which allows us to say anything in our language, but a feature of that is that we can't say anything about logic. Logical properties of propositions are shown, they are not said. You cannot use a proposition to say something about logical form because every proposition shows its logical form. So you can't, it's a bit like trying to jump on your own shadow. You can't jump on your own shadow because every time you jump, your shadow moves. Analogously, you cannot use language to say something about logical form. So that's where Wittgenstein was at the beginning of the First World War. His father died in January 1914. In the summer of 1914, Wittgenstein left Norway to return to Vienna, for he thought a brief time, but then the First World War broke out. He couldn't get back to Norway, and he decided to enlist in the Austrian army as a private soldier. His brothers had commissions in fancy cavalry regiments. He enlisted in an engineering regiment as a private. Now, for the first 2 years of the war, he was kept safely behind the lines because the military authorities figured, well, he's Wittgenstein. We don't want to use him as cannon fodder. Wittgenstein, however, wanted to be at the front line because he wanted the experience of facing death. And the reason he wanted the experience of facing death is that he'd read William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience, in which William James interviews people who've had a profound religious experience and asks them to describe what happened. And many of them described that at some stage or other they faced death, and the facing death brought them to a profound point at which, often resulting in a religious conversion experience. Wittgenstein read that and was very moved by it and wrote to Russell, well, this, he said, look, I think this book improves me in a way that I very much want to improve. He wasn't religious at this point. He didn't have any religious beliefs, but he wanted very much to have some kind of, he thought that if he could face death, then his life would be deepened, enriched by the experience. So he kept applying to the authorities to be moved, and the authorities thought that what he wanted was an even safer point. So he kept applying to go to the front line, and they kept moving it further back from the right. Eventually, in 1916, he got his wish, and he was moved to the Russian front. On the way, he went into a bookshop, and the only book they had was Tolstoy's The Gospel in Brief, which he read over and over and over again. And his fellow soldiers called him the man with the Gospels because he was never seen without this book. Extraordinarily, when he got to the front, so he's right on the Russian front now, he took part in the Brusilov offensive. It was the Russian Brusilov offensive, but the Austrian troops were facing that offensive. And Wittgenstein was right there then. The Austrians had to retreat over the Carpathian Mountains, and Wittgenstein was with that retreating army, pursued by the Russians. A lot of people died. It was absolute hell. All the time, he's writing philosophy. in his journals. Now, he had the practice of writing personal remarks in his manuscripts, interspersed with his philosophy. But those personal remarks were separated from his philosophical remarks by being written in a code that Margaret had taught him when he was a boy. A very simple code, A equals Z, B equals Y, and so on. So that when you look at it, it looks complete gibberish, but it's actually not very difficult to master. But in 1916, in his journals, we suddenly have this, written not in code, but as if it was part of his philosophical reflection. So we have reflections about the nature of logic, about the nature of a proposition, about mathematics, and then suddenly we have, what do I know about God and the purpose of life? And then he says, to believe in a God means to understand the meaning of life. To believe in God means to see that the facts of the world are not the end of the matter. The solution to the problem of life is to be seen in the disappearance of the problem. Isn't this the reason why men to whom the meaning of life had become clear after long doubting could not say what this meaning consisted in? Then when, towards the end of the war, he was a Italian prisoner of war when the war finished, and because the Italians held their German and Austrian prisoners as sort of bargaining material, he didn't actually get back to Vienna until a year after the war. And he returned with the manuscript of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, his first philosophical book, which is, I think, the most extraordinary book ever published in prose. Its style is unusual, it consists of numbered propositions, but also its content is unusual. About 5/6 of the book is about logic and language. And then the final sixth is about mysticism. And what happens then in the book is that the distinction he'd earlier applied to logic, the distinction between what can be said and what cannot be said that has to be shown, is now applied by him to what he regards as the deep parts of life. Ethics, aesthetics, God, the meaning of life. All of these things now share with logic the property of being inexpressible. You cannot put them into words. There are indeed ethical truths about the meaning of life, and we can see them, they can be shown, but they cannot be said. So when he tried to get Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus published, he had it turned down by all sorts of publishers. He wrote to one of the prospective publishers, one thinker, who said, this book really consists of two parts, the part that I've written and the part that I haven't. And he said it's precisely the second part that is the most important. Now, as a way of selling a book to a publisher, this is a bit dodgy. But it indicates the importance that Wittgenstein attached to that which cannot be said, that which has to be shown, that which, in the words of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, has to remain inexpressible. In the book itself, it says, there are indeed things that cannot be put into words. They make themselves manifest. Much later on, he said, in art, it is hard to say anything that is as good as saying nothing. He made a friend towards the end of the war, an Austrian, Paul Engelmann, who wasn't at all interested in the philosophy of mathematics or logic, and those parts of the book meant nothing to him, but Engelmann was deeply interested in mysticism. And Engelmann sent Wittgenstein a poem called Count Eberhard's Hawthorne, which he thought exemplified what Wittgenstein was saying about the importance of the inexpressible. And Wittgenstein was delighted by it. He said, this is how it is. If only you do not try to utter what is unutterable, then nothing gets lost. But the unutterable will be unutterably contained in what has been uttered. So very quickly, here is the poem in question. Count Eberhard's Hawthorne. Count Eberhard rustled beard from Württemberg's fair land, on holy errand steered to Palestina's strand. The while he slowly rode along a woodland way, he cut from the hawthorn bush a little fresh green spray. Then in his iron helm a little sprig he placed, and bore it in the wars and o'er the ocean waste. And when he reached his home, he placed it in the earth, where little leaves and buds the gentle spring called forth. He went to it each year, the count so brave and true, and overjoyed was he to witness how it grew. The count was worn with age, the sprig became a tree, neath which the old man oft would sit in reverie. The branching arch so high, whose whisper is so bland, reminds him of the past and Palestina's strand. Now, what is unutterable there, what is not even attempted to be said, is what the sprig and then the hawthorn bush means to the count. But Wittgenstein's point is precisely because of the simplicity of the language, precisely because it describes simply what can be described without attempting the inexpressible, then the inexpressible, the immense meaning that this hawthorn had for Count Eberhard, that significance gets across in the poetry. Wittgenstein considered Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus to answer all the problems of philosophy. He wasn't a modest man. And he wrote in the preface, this book solves all the problems of philosophy. So there was no more philosophy to be done. So what was he to do? Well, he first of all trained as an elementary school teacher. But he was a disastrously bad elementary school teacher because he was so impatient. He tried to teach them logic. And this was in the lower Austrian farming districts. And the kids wanted to get home and help their parents with the farm. They didn't want to learn logic. And so they were resistant, and Wittgenstein lost his temper and hit several of the children. For which he later did a sort of penitential trip to these lower Austrian villages, visiting the homes of each child he'd hit and apologizing for it, a bit like a sort of Latter-day Saint or something. But he was stripped of his teaching job, went back to Vienna and concentrated on art and architecture. He sculpted this bust of the young lady and designed this extraordinary house for his sister, Margaret, who loved it. Everybody else in the family hated it. Amina described it as house-embodied logic. There are no ornamental features in this house whatsoever. The lighting is all bare light bulbs. There are no ornaments on the external of the building. If it has a beauty, and I think it does, the beauty is all about proportion. That's what Wittgenstein thought anyway. He added enormously to the cost of the building by going in one day and saying, this ceiling isn't quite right, it needs to be raised 3 centimeters. And so at enormous cost and the exasperation of the builders, the ceiling was indeed raised 3 centimeters. Whereupon Wittgenstein said, that's better. This house is now the cultural department of the Bulgarian embassy in Vienna, and it's not in great shape, but it does at least still survive. But Wittgenstein was not, at that point, he lists as his profession in his passport, architect. But he was always going to return to philosophy, and the catalyst for bringing him back to philosophy was this man here, Frank Ramsey, who was an absolutely brilliant young man from Cambridge. So Ramsey died in 1930. He was only 24 years old or something. But he'd already made fundamentally important contributions to logic, to economics, the philosophy of mathematics, to mathematics itself. There's a whole branch of mathematics called Ramsey theory. He was a stunningly brilliant man. A friend of the Bloomsbury group. He was known by Francis Partridge, Virginia Woolf, and so on. And he became very interested in the Tractatus in the 1920s when Wittgenstein was still a school teacher. But he thought that some things weren't quite right. He wasn't persuaded that it solved all the problems of philosophy. So he sought out Wittgenstein's school in the Austrian hills, took with him a book and went through the book line by line with Wittgenstein and persuaded him that it hadn't actually solved all the problems of philosophy. And so Wittgenstein then, when the house was finished, returned to Cambridge in 1929, initially as Ramsay's student. Initially his status was a research student with Ramsay as his supervisor. But Ramsay died in 1930, Wittgenstein started lecturing at Cambridge and developed a completely new philosophy, one that has no precedent in the history of the subject, which begins with an abandonment of the notion of logical form. The notion that plays a key role in the Tractatus is the idea that our language is structured according to a logical form which mirrors the form of the world, which is what allows us to say things about the world. In his later work, he completely ditches that notion of logical form. There is no single form which shapes our language. Rather, he says, we must understand our language not in terms of its structure, its form, but in terms of its context, in terms of what we do with words, how our language is woven into our everyday activities and our everyday culture. And he presents his early work as typical of a certain kind of philosophical confusion, which he says one sees also in the writings of Plato. So in a typical Platonic dialogue, a question gets raised. What is truth? What is knowledge? What is justice? And Socrates asks that question of the people around him. And typically, they begin by giving examples of justice, truth, knowledge. And then Socrates says, usually, no, I don't want examples. I want to know the essence of truth, the essence of justice. Wittgenstein's later philosophy is based on the idea that that is where philosophy goes wrong, in its search for essences, which is a denial of the messy contingency of language. According to Wittgenstein, we should be happy with the first step in the dialogue, which is examples of justice, of knowledge. And happy also in accepting that there need not be one thing that unites every example of justice, every example of knowledge. Rather, he says, there can be a series of similarities and dissimilarities. He says, think of the concept of a game and all the things we call games. There are board games, there are ball games, there are team games, individual games. Is there one thing that they all have in common? No. Rather, he says, there is a series of similarities and dissimilarities, which he calls family resemblances. He says it's rather like the members of the family. You can recognize family similarities, but it won't always be the same similarity. Some members of the family will be identified as members of the family because they have the same nose. Some will have the same eyes. Some will have the same cheekbones. Some will have the same gestures with their hands. And he was so interested in this notion that he had this composite photograph made, which has only recently, well, in the last 10 years, come to light. And when you first look at the photograph, you think it's a photograph of an individual person. And then you notice that it's a bit odd because around the neck there is both a scarf and a necklace and a collar. And the reason for that is that that composite photograph is made by putting together the picture. Here's Ludwig Wittgenstein, and here are his sisters, Margaret, Amina, Helena. And he puts those pictures together. And he says, by putting them together, one can see the connections between the two, between, in this case, the four. And this notion of seeing connections, which is literally illustrated by this Gausonian photograph, this composite photograph, became a key notion in the later philosophy. So in place of essences, we have family resemblance. In place of a theory of logical form, we have an insistence on the importance of the understanding that consists in seeing connections, which Wittgenstein says is right at the heart of many non-scientific forms of understanding. Think, for example, of understanding a piece of music. Think of two different experiences. The experience of somebody with what's called amusia. Oliver Sacks has written on this condition. Amusia is the condition of not being able to hear meaning in music. Now think, so somebody with amusia experiences music as just a noise, an incoherent noise. Think of that experience compared with the experience of somebody who has a deep understanding of music. The difference between the two is not that the one who understands, who listens to the piece of music, hears, let's say there's a tremendous expression of, overwhelming grief in a piece of music. But also, so they hear that, but also they hear the, as it were, more technical aspects of the piece of music. They hear that this is a theme, and they hear that this is a variation on that theme, and they hear that this is a key change, and so on and so on. There's all sorts of things that they hear that people who don't understand music don't hear. And Wittgenstein says the difference between the two is not that the one who hears music with meaning has a theory. It's not an application of a theory. It's, as it were, a direct experience. It's to do with the way they are hearing that piece of music. Likewise with poetry. Wittgenstein read a lot of poetry and was very influenced by poetry. He once said, I think I summed up my attitude to philosophy when I said philosophy ought to be written as if it were poetry. And again, the understanding of a poem is to do with reading it correctly, putting the right emphasis on it, reading it with the right rhythm, hearing it correctly. And then think of the understanding we have of each other. When you understand somebody deeply and intimately, it's not because you have a theory of them, it's because you know them, you're sympathetic with them. You can hear their voice correctly, you can interpret their facial expressions correctly, you can interpret what's called their body language correctly, and so on and so on. All of this goes up to seeing things, seeing the understanding that consists in seeing connections, which Wittgenstein insists is also the understanding at the heart of philosophy. And so he puts great emphasis on our ability to change the way we see things. We can see the duck, we can see the rabbit, we can decide to see one and then the other. And Wittgenstein says this is what the philosopher is aiming for. The philosopher is not aiming to construct a theory of logical form, meaning, or whatever. The philosopher is trying to get us to see things differently. To see things under a new aspect, as Wittgenstein puts it. Wittgenstein never succeeded in putting his later work into a form, into a book that he was happy with, and he left that task to his literary executors. But in 1947, he left England for Ireland, eventually at the west coast of Ireland, which is where he lived in this building here, which is now a youth hostel on the west coast of Ireland, trying desperately to get his work to prepare his work, get his manuscripts into order as a book. And again, he lived very simply. I went to this hostel when I was researching my book, and I met the man whose job it was to visit Wittgenstein every day, give him his peat, because in that part of Ireland, peat is used for burning fuel and all sorts of things. So he gave him his peat, and also he said, his name was Jimmy, he said that every day he would arrive and there would be a pile of manuscripts there for him to burn. And I said to him, well, weren't you ever tempted to take them away and not burn them? Because after all, they would be worth a lot of money. And he said, oh no, I wasn't tempted to. I said, they had writing all over them. So no, he wasn't. But he did look after Wittgenstein when Wittgenstein lived in this cottage. Wittgenstein became increasingly unwell. The diagnosis was cancer, and he returned to Cambridge, where towards the end he lived with his doctor, Ernest Bevan, and he left the task of finishing his work to three people, one of whom is here, George von Wright, a Finnish philosopher who replaced Wittgenstein as Professor of Philosophy at Cambridge, together with Elizabeth Anscombe and Rush Rees. He said he gave to those three people the task of preparing his later work in the form of the book that we now have called Philosophical Investigations. He died in 1951 at the age of 62, and his last words spoken to Mrs. Bevan were, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life," which is what I've tried to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. And we have a minute for questions.
Yes, well, thank you very much for your talk. I've read your books on Russell and on Wittgenstein. I enjoy them a lot. So,
Thank you.
I'm really a fan of your
Thank you.
of your biographical work. Of course,
I sense a but coming on.
well, I think the main point of your talk was that the connection between Wittgenstein's philosophy and his life.
Yeah.
And I reckon that that has to do, I mean, with your explanation of the distinction between saying and show.
Okay. Yeah.
So, but I didn't quite grasp the way in which you think that this has to do with his life. You see, you know?
Yeah. Okay. No, good.
I can see that it has to do with his readings, with
Yeah.
his
Yeah. No, good.
cultural influence,
Good.
but with
Yeah.
his own life.
Yeah. No, good. Okay. So we have this distinction between saying and showing, and it reappears in the later work in a different guise with the importance of the way one sees something. Now, the connection with that and the role of biography is this, and I should have made this clear, you're right, that supposing you have two people being silent, you have no way of knowing what they're, as it were, being silent about. So like the story that I told yesterday, I think, of the logical positivist, Otto Neurath, who glossed the final sentence of the Tractatus, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Otto Neurath said, we must indeed be silent, but not about anything. Okay, so now there's all the difference in the world between Otto Neurath's logical positivism and Wittgenstein's mysticism. There's a crucially important difference there, but the difference is not going to appear, as it were, on the written page. Precisely because Wittgenstein's mysticism is included by him in that which one cannot say. So when Wittgenstein says, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, there is a whole set of attitudes behind that. And I think the role of biography is to give an idea of, to use a Wittgensteinian expression, the spirit in which that is said. He published a series of prefaces in 1930, no, he didn't publish, he wrote a series of prefaces in 1930-31 because he thought he would get his later work together in those years. And in several of these prefaces he says, well, in one of them he says this, it's all the same to me whether the typical Western scientist understands me or not, because in any case he won't understand the spirit in which I write. And that, I think, is the role of biography. So you're asking, how does this connect with saying and showing? Well, the biography then can do what Wittgenstein can't do, which is, as it were, say what it is that he's not saying. In reading what kind of man he is, the importance that music has for him, the impression that Tolstoy's Gospel in Brief had on him, and so on and so on. all of that goes to build up a picture of what kind of person he is, and therefore, as it were, what he's being silent about. Does that make sense?
May I ask another question? I believe that many of the philosophers that work in what is so-called analytic philosophy today would consider that philosophy should be rid of any sort of biographical elements. So that a philosophy that needs some sort of biography in order to be understood is to some extent a kind of impure scientific piece of work. I think that's the predominant view of philosophical work today. And what do you think about that? Do you think that we are in some sort of decadent period of philosophy, or rather that we have advanced, you see?
Let me very quickly summarize what I said yesterday, because I addressed precisely that point.
Sorry,
No, it's okay. So the view that you're describing rightly as the predominant view of analytic philosophers, I called yesterday, following James Conant, I called it compartmentalism. So Conant says that with regard to the relationship between life and work, we have two possible views. But we have two views that should be avoided. Right? Both of them should be avoided. The first is reductivism, that attempts to reduce the work to the life. The second is compartmentalism, which says, look, the work and life have nothing to do with each other. And as you say, most analytic philosophers are compartmentalists. Now, I'm not a compartmentalist, but that doesn't mean that I think every piece of philosophy should be approached biographically. In fact, it's not even possible to do that. And it goes beyond philosophy too. I mean, we're forced to understand Shakespeare's works without knowing much about Shakespeare, right? So clearly that's possible. And clearly it's not essential in every piece of philosophy to know something about the biography of the philosopher. In many cases, it's not even possible. Now, a part of your question is, I think I'm right in saying that part of your question was, is it a weakness if a work of philosophy cannot be understood without some biographical understanding? Was that part of your question? Okay, my view is that that's not the case. So it's not my view that you cannot understand Wittgenstein's philosophy unless you know something about him. My view is rather that if you know something about him, it gets easier to understand the spirit in which he writes. But just as some of us are better than others at understanding facial expressions, tones of voice. And it can help sometimes, somebody saying, look, that's how that person sounds when they're irritated. And that sort of tip, as it were, could help. And that's what I see a biographer doing. I see a biographer giving people a series of tips so as to read the work in the right spirit. But I think it's perfectly possible that some astute readers, and some astute readers did do that of the Tractatus. I mean, before anything was known about Wittgenstein biographically, you had some readers who were, hearing, as it were, the voice of Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, and hearing that it was a very different voice to the voice of Bertrand Russell, and so on. So that is possible. It's not that biography is necessary. So your question about, well, if it's necessary, is that a weakness of the philosophy? That doesn't arise, because it seems to me that it's never necessary, but sometimes it's useful. And its usefulness varies from philosopher to philosopher. I don't think it helps much to understand Carnap's life, to understand Carnap's work. Might do, might not, but it seems to me that there are some philosophers for whom it's more useful to know something about them in reading their work correctly, and some who it's not. Kurt Gödel might be an example of somebody, well, you're not going to read, if you know some biographical facts about Kurt Gödel, you're not going to read his proof of incompleteness in a different way. Yeah?
Excuse me. Returning to the relationship between logic and ethics, do you think that it is the way for Wittgenstein to go to his mysticism or something like that?
Do I think what?
The relationship between logic and ethics, you have explained it.
Yeah.
Do you think that it is the way for Wittgenstein to go down to his mysticism?
I missed the key word. Do I think it's the...
Is the mysticism a connection between the logic and
And
the
ethics, or something like that?
I don't think I'd put it like that. I think I'd say that the view that logic is, to use Wittgenstein's word, ineffable, that logic is inexpressible, and the view that ethics is also inexpressible. Those two are two parts of the mysticism. It's not that the mysticism is somehow what links the two. It's that the mysticism, those two things are part of the mysticism, and another part might be the idea that the meaning of life is inexpressible. So they're all part of, you know, that's
The whole
mysticism.
thing.
Yeah, the whole thing, indeed. Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
You were saying just a few moments ago about example of the rabbit and the duck,
Yeah.
and they choose to sing one way or another.
Yeah.
What about to see the thing in an absolute way? You know,
What does that mean to see it in an absolute way?
in a total way, not just one way or another. Even, but
So there might be two ways of doing that.
But twice.
I can imagine you're not seeing either the rabbit or the duck, or is it that you're seeing both the rabbit and the duck at the same time?
you can see the rabbit in some moment. You can see the duck in another.
Yeah.
Moment, if you want.
Yeah.
If you want.
Yeah.
But you can see twice, you know, and now see the image in an absolute way, you know.
But would this be an example of seeing it in an absolute way, where you say you're not seeing it as a duck, you're not seeing it as a rabbit, you're saying, oh, that's Wittgenstein's duck rabbit, right? Is that what seeing it as an absolute?
Can you repeat that?
So you don't say that's a duck,
Uh-huh.
and you don't say that's a rabbit. You say that's Wittgenstein's duck rabbit.
Okay.
Would that capture what you mean by
it's twice. It's a two. It's, you know.
But I'm still not getting. So when you
It's they are the two at the same time.
and so if you say, look, that's a duck rabbit, does that capture what you mean by saying that it's two at the same time?
It could be a rabbit or a duck.
Yeah.
It depends of your perspective,
Yeah.
how you see it. But it could be twice, both.
Both a duck rabbit.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Preserving the ambiguity of it.
An absolute.
Sorry?
An absolute.
I'm not happy with the word absolute. It seems to me that what's happening there is a bit like when you realise that a word is ambiguous, but you're happy with the ambiguity. So, for example, my tutor, Peter Strawson at Oxford, wrote a book about Kant called The Bounds of Sense. It's a very clever title because bound here has two meanings. It means something is bound to happen, it's inevitable that it's going to happen, or it could mean that it's a boundary. Sense also has two meanings. It could mean, sense can mean meaning, and sense can be one of the five senses, seeing, hearing. So bounds of sense, both bound is ambiguous and sense is ambiguous, which means that there's four different meanings of that phrase, the bounds of sense, each of which is applicable to Kant's critique of pure reason. And the reason Strawson chose that title was precisely because of that ambiguity. So, and preserving that ambiguity. So I think what you're calling an absolute way of seeing, I would prefer to describe as a way of seeing that preserves the ambiguity. And I think some poetic and artistic ways of presenting and writing and so on deliberately preserve ambiguity in just that kind of way.
Okay. Good. Thanks.
Oh, yes. Oh. You didn't say it. No, sorry. You didn't say anything about his teaching in Cambridge.
Oh, no, I didn't. No.
Why? And could you say something when
Well,
he started? And,
yeah.
when he started and how he gets at the university teaching, because he didn't study formally. He didn't follow the program.
Yeah.
Properly.
Yeah. No, that would have been an interesting theme to develop, and I'll develop it now. One interesting thing about that is that I don't believe there is a university, another university in the world that would have hired Wittgenstein as a teacher in 1930. He wouldn't have got through the door at Oxford because he'd never read any Aristotle. He didn't know any Greek. He hadn't studied Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and Descartes, and all of those. And he wouldn't have got a job in Berlin or Vienna. It was only in Cambridge. And why did he get a job in Cambridge? Because in Cambridge, and this is, this speaks massively, in Cambridge's favour, I think, that they're not going to say, look, where are your formal qualifications? He had none. He didn't have any formal qualifications. They said, okay, Bertrand Russell thinks you're a genius. That's good enough for us. And so they arranged, actually, in order to give him a formal qualification, they arranged a PhD via where the Tractatus was the PhD thesis. And his examiners were G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell. And G.E. Moore's report on this viva says, in the examiner's opinion, this is a work of genius. Nevertheless, it passes the criteria for a PhD at Cambridge. Yeah.
So, I have a superiority to Wittgenstein. I actually read Aristotle.
Okay.
And one of the things I've noticed is that modern virtue ethics seems to strangely come out of analytic philosophy. Like the people who turn to virtue ethics have largely or disproportionately come from analytic philosophy, which has its roots in Wittgenstein's, in the later Wittgenstein. And
Are you thinking now of Martin Nussbaum? Or?
yeah, I'm Anscombe and
Right.
And that seems to me, that struck me. And you think and when you mention music,
Yeah.
and to appreciate music, that's seeing something. You can't explain music to someone with a museum.
Right.
And if you think that's important, then you have to posit there is that virtue, that capacity.
Okay.
So do you think it's not accidental that there is this connection between?
I think what you're saying is enormously interesting, but I've never had the same thought. But I have now. So thank you very much. But it is interesting, yeah. But of course, we had virtue ethics before we had analytic philosophy. Sure. But what you're saying about analytic philosophers, as it were, I mean, have I got this right? Is your thought this, that analytic philosophy has gaps, and that people from that background turn to virtue ethics in order to fill those gaps? Is that the thought? Yeah. It seems to me that's got a lot going for it. Yeah.
Could I ask a completely unrelated question?
Yeah.
How would this approach apply to Heidegger?
I don't know. I've read. I can't make head or tail of Heidegger. I know it's disappointing. I've tried many times, and I just cannot understand it. I can't get past the hyphenated verbal monstrosities, as Rudiger Sopransky calls them, all those hyphenated words. And I have no idea what he's talking about. Now, people have told me that there are some similarities between Heidegger's thinking and Wittgenstein's, but I have to take that on trust because I can't understand Heidegger. I have read a biography of Heidegger by Sopransky, and it's interesting. I mean, as well as finding Heidegger's work impenetrable, what I know of him as a person, I don't find at all sympathetic. And also the lectures he gave, the notorious lectures he gave, asking his students to adopt the Führer principle, seems to me absolutely unforgivable. And the anti-Semitism that has appeared in black notebooks. So yeah, so my view of Heidegger doesn't get much beyond regarding him as an obscurantist fascist, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Which is your next biography?
Heidegger.
So you don't plan to write? No more biographies.
Well, I don't know. I have been asked to consider writing a biography of Isaiah Berlin. And that would be interesting.
There is already one.
There is already one by Ignacio.
Ignacio.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. But I think there's room for another one.
Great.
For Carla.
Sorry?
Carla.
Carnap, yeah.
He had a daughter in Mexico.
Yes, I knew that. Yeah. I for a while I considered writing one. Many years ago, I considered writing a biography of Karl Popper. And this was because of something very naughty that Brian McGee did. Do you know Brian McGee? He's popularizer of philosophy. I got to know Brian McGee, and he said to me, Karl Popper really wants you. This is when Karl Popper was still alive.
Yeah.
He said to me, Karl Popper really wants you to write his biography.
Oh.
Then he went to Karl Popper and he said to Karl Popper, Ray Monk really wants to write his biography. So then he arranged a meeting between me and Karl Popper. We were meeting at completely cross purposes. I thought the point of the meeting was for me to find out whether he'd led an interesting enough life to write a biography. He thought we were meeting in order for him to decide whether I was sufficiently Popperian to write a biography of Popper. So it came to nothing.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, did Wittgenstein have any preference about doing philosophy in English or German? And is this of any relevance? Have you seen any relevance?
That's interesting. Yeah.
On this?
I think he did have a preference, and his preference was for German.
German.
Yeah. Every now and again, though, he writes in English. In the manuscripts, every now and again, he'll say something in English because it's an English idiomatic expression that he's come across, for which there is no German equivalent. I remember one. It takes all sorts. Do you know this English expression?
No.
It's an expression meaning, look, be tolerant of strange people because it takes all sorts of people to make a work. So you should be, if somebody's slightly odd, don't worry about it. And Wittgenstein loved that expression, it takes all sorts. And it comes up more than once in his manuscripts. But mostly German. And when he's thinking through a topic, he'll do it in German. Of course, he lectured in English. And so those lectures are, him thinking aloud in English, which he certainly could do, but I think he preferred to do it in German.
Okay. The Tractatus was written originally in German?
Sorry?
The Tractatus?
The Tractatus was written in German, yes. He oversaw the translation by Ogden. He had a correspondence with Ogden. Sorry, I can't resist an anecdote about that. But, so Ogden was in touch with the publishers. Ogden was working for the publishers for Ampliage. He was translating the book and corresponding with Wittgenstein. And he wrote to Wittgenstein saying, look, you told me once that these remarks were distilled from a vast number of other remarks. And he said, my publisher has asked me, can we include some of these other remarks? Because after all, it's quite a small book. And Wittgenstein wrote the most beautiful reply to that. He wrote to Ogden saying, look, it's as if you've gone to a man who's made you a table and said, can I have all the shavings that you produced when you made this table? He said, the remarks that I've left out of the book are precisely the ones that should be left out. So he would have nothing to do with the other.
And the last part of the Tractatus, it's here refers to people that are in the limit of, we people are in the limits of the world. So could you talk about that?
Yes. So in the preface of the Tractatus, he says that his task is to trace the limits of thought. And then he adds a qualification and said, no, not thought, because in order to trace the limits of thought, you would have to think both sides of that limit. And of course, that's impossible because you cannot think the other side of the limit of thought. So he says, I'm not tracing the limits of thought, I'm tracing the limits of language. Right? And then I think in the remarks you're thinking of where he says, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. Is that the remark you're thinking of?
Yeah, but there's a part from, for example, I think it's a proposition, next, the further proposition from 6 refers to some kind of a drawing of an eye.
So kind of
a drawing of an eye.
And an eye, yeah.
An eye,
That's in
yeah.
connection with this idea that the limits of my the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And yes, and the eye is, and he says about an autobiography, he says, look, you know, if I were to describe the world as it appears to me, I would not be in it, right? Because, you know, I mean, if I look at my visual field here, and as I turn around, the one thing that's not going to appear in it is me. Just like when you move the camera around, you're never going to get the camera in shot, right? So that's the point of the picture. The point of the picture is that what the eye is seeing does not include the eye. And so the eye in both senses, the eye that sees and the I as in the self, is not in the world, it's a limit of the world. But the world, he says, is my world. The world is, it's a Kantian idea, or a Schopenhauerian idea, that the world is the world as it appears to me. So it's my world, but I am not one of the objects in the world. That's the idea.
So that, well, he refers to that as if we were part of metaphysics.
Well, he talks about the metaphysical I. And the metaphysical I is the limit of the world, but not in the world. So yes, it's a metaphysical idea, to be sure. Yeah. And also, of course, one should bear in mind the penultimate remark of the Tractatus, where he confesses that all of the preceding propositions don't satisfy his criteria for meaningfulness. So he says, well, strictly speaking, these propositions are meaningless, and then he has the metaphor of the analogy of the ladder, that they're like the steps of the ladder. You climb up the ladder and then you kick the ladder away.
I have one comment. I think it's very important consider important things, for example, in the cycle of Vienna, Wittgenstein and Molière a counter and discussion of different things for logic and proposition of the world. And it's very important in the story of the life of Wittgenstein.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
These are one comment.
Yeah. No, that's good. And that's right. And those conversations with Schlick, to begin with, they included Rudolf Carnap and Otto Neurath, and then bit by bit it narrowed down to Wittgenstein, Schlick, and Weissman. And you're right, they are very important for Wittgenstein's philosophical development. The transcripts of those conversations were made and they've now been published as Wittgenstein and the Vienna Circle. And also the work that Weissman was doing separately with Wittgenstein, that has also been published. And they give a fascinating insight into the shift from the early philosophy to the later philosophy. Yeah. And also those conversations began before he returned to Cambridge in 1929. Yeah, no, you're right. I emphasize the role of Frank Ramsey, but Schlick and Weissman also had an important role.
For example, other things very important, the people actually thinking the Wittgenstein is a great philosopher, the philosophy analytic. very important, for example, discussion of Circle of Vienna. Wittgenstein considered the philosophy analytic and logic is very important in the structure of the work. This point is very important, for example, in induction and other traditions in philosophy.
No, I agree, but also important is the difference between Wittgenstein and logical positivism. I think it's Carnap, isn't it, that tells the story of Wittgenstein turning up to the meeting with a book of poems by Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian poet. And instead of engaging in philosophical discussion with Schlick and Weizmann, he turned his back on them and read them Tagore's poems. That's quite a statement, I think.
Thanks.
One last question.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Many important thinkers have writings on politics.
Yeah.
Can I find something Wittgenstein wrote?
On politics?
Yeah, on politics. In which diaries or something?
Yeah. No. I mean, there are sporadic remarks about politics.
Okay.
But they don't add up, well, they certainly don't add up to a political philosophy. But they do give interesting indications of his politics. But it's very hard to put them all together to form a coherent view of what Wittgenstein's politics were. And also one has to, in trying to think about Wittgenstein politics, not just take into account not just what he wrote, but also what he did. So in 1935, for example, he made steps to move to the Soviet Union. And he actually applied to live in the Soviet Union. And he went to the Soviet Union, he had meetings with officials at the University of Leningrad and in Moscow, who offered him a chair in philosophy. But that's not why he wanted to go to Soviet. He didn't want to go to the Soviet Union as a professor of philosophy. He already had that in Cambridge. What he thought he would do in the Soviet Union is contribute to what he considered to be a new way of life. But they weren't going to put Wittgenstein in a collective farm. He was already a notable philosopher by then. So he came back from the Soviet Union having been offered chairs in philosophy and gave up the idea. But the very fact that he would entertain the idea in 1935, during the show trials, is that in 1935, the fact that he would even entertain the idea of moving to the Soviet Union suggests, a certain naivety about politics, I would have thought. I got to know somebody who was a friend of Wittgenstein's, but not a philosopher, a man called Gilbert Patterson, who was a banker, actually, when I met him. Very, very wealthy man, came from a very well-off background, spoke with that sort of plummy British voice, and I talked to him about that period. And he said to me that he had joined the Communist Party. And he's the least likely communist you could ever meet. And I said to him, well, why did you become a communist? And he said, oh, we all were in those days, He said, it's rather like becoming a Buddhist now. But no, it's you can find sporadic remarks of Wittgenstein's on politics. I guess, broadly speaking, they show that politically he was left-wing. But even then, people have found remarks that they interpret as showing that he's a conservative in various ways. But he certainly allied himself with the left-wing, and I think significantly most of his friends were on the hard left. Rush Rees was a member of a Trotskyist group. Many of his friends were members of the Communist Party, and so on. So I think, broadly speaking, he's on the left.
Just for curiosity, do you have any idea of what was he meaning by reading Somerset Maugham?
I'm sorry?
Do you have any idea of what was he meaning by reading Somerset Maugham? I don't remember.
Oh, Somerset Maugham.
That's
an extraordinary remark, isn't it? This is in connection with Peter Geach. Are you thinking about his remark about Peter Geach?
I barely remember that part, and Don't get that.
I think the only time Somerset Maugham is mentioned in my Somerset Maugham is an English novelist. I think the only time he's mentioned in my book is with a remark that I admit that I don't understand. Somebody asked him what he thought of P.T. Beach, and in reply he said he reads Somerset Maugham. That's all he said. I have no idea what he meant by that. Someone has suggested to me that he misheard the question, and somebody asked him actually, what's Peter reading these days?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.